And next up, we have Dr. Alison Fox-Resnick. Dr. Alison Fox-Resnick began her teaching career in New York City, where she taught 3rd and 5th grades, before moving back to her hometown near Seattle, where she taught 5th grade. The schools she worked with had very different cultures and orientations towards student and teacher learning. Her experience at the last school she taught at allowed her to experience the power of learning and community as a teacher and the magic of creating a joyful mathematics classroom where children play with and grow ideas. It was at that point that Dr. Resnick left the classroom to learn how to create such vibrant and collaborative learning communities for all adults and children. She spent 8 years as an elementary mathematics teacher educator and researcher at the University of Washington, 4 years as a consultant partnering with districts to puzzle through the co-design of educator learning for equity-oriented instructional transformation, and is just beginning her role as a researcher at the University of Colorado Boulder. Over the next 2 days, Dr. Resnick will be speaking with us about our goals for student learning and what that means for educator learning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alison Fox-Resnick.
Yeah. Okay, is this working? All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. One thing I will add, because you might be wondering, why am I here if I work across the country? I actually moved to Michigan about, 13 months ago now. I live in Ann Arbor, and I'm working with those organizations remotely. I really could not be more thrilled to be landing in Michigan in this really exciting moment that you all are embarking on. So, we're going to be thinking together. You might have seen in the program, I get to think with you a few times the next couple of days about what it means to really lead this kind of mathematics transformation. And I think it's important, you heard Rusty and Trish using this word transformation. I like it better than improvement in this case. A lot of times in education we use the word improvement, and what it ends up being is a little bit of kind of tweaking around the edges. What you should be starting to get a sense of, especially after what we just heard, this requires some really fundamental transformations in how we're thinking about what mathematics looks like in our classrooms. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is what it looks like around our classrooms, which Amy was getting to a little bit, right? That we have to think about how our educators are feeling and how they are thinking about math in order to get to how children are thinking about math and experiencing math. So part of what Rusty and Trish talked about is that one of the goals here is to develop some shared lenses and visions. Here's the thing about any policy documents or educational plans, which you have in your little laminated folder, right? We've seen many of them as educators. What research shows, and you've probably seen over and over again, is that we interpret them in lots of different ways. If we just handed everyone this document and everyone read it, we would all come away with some really different ideas, actually, because every single word in these documents brings up our own experiences, our own lenses, our own visions. So part of what we're going to be working on together, and you're going to get a lot of group work time, is to start developing some common lenses to interpret these documents through, and to start thinking about how you're going to lead your bigger teams in doing the same work. And one of the lenses, there's lots of lenses we can think about. The lens I am going to be having you think about today is our conceptions of learning. So how do we bring the conceptions of learning that we all have to our interpretation of these documents, and how to be really clear with each other about maybe places we need to critically reflect on our conceptions of learning and develop some new conceptions of learning so that we're talking about and designing for the same thing. So what do I mean by conceptions of learning? We all have implicit conceptions of learning that shape our leadership of learning and educational change. What do I mean here? So conceptions are our images and assumptions, and when we think about learning, it means it could be our assumptions about learners and who learners are, our goals for those learners, how that learning might unfold for them, and what supports their learning. We have these ideas about all the learners in our system. Some of them are children, teachers, and leaders. That's who we're going to be focusing on the next couple days. We also have ideas about family learning. We have ideas about our own learning outside of our professions, right? There's lots of other conceptions of learning we have. We're going to be focusing on these three. And here's why this is important. And we can use the videos that we saw earlier. So think about the very first video we saw, the math talk, where they were looking at the arrays. There is nothing magical about that activity. There are ways to enact that activity that could have looked very, very different. You may actually have some examples in your head. What guided that teacher to enact it in the way that she did was her conception of her children's learning. So that's what guided her in how she responded to kids. We had that example of not hearing sarcastic responses, right? Her poker face at all the different ideas, that's her conception of learning, guiding that. Her choice of an enactment of that activity in the first place. Some teachers might think, that's not math. It shaped how she created her classroom culture and norms. It's shaping, we didn't get to see this, but how she sequenced that activity. You saw some math words on the wall, right? They've clearly been working on arrays. How did this fall into the sequence of activities? That was her conception of her children's mathematical learning. It also is going to shape, which we didn't see again as much, but how does she respond if a kid struggles? There are lots of different ways to respond to a kid who struggles with a math task. That's going to be shaped by your conception of their learning, who they are as a learner, your goals for them, how you think their learning unfolds, and what you think will support it. So we're going to be bringing this lens to these two documents. Today we're going to focus on the instructional practices. Tomorrow we'll zoom in on the organizational practices in relation to that, but really focusing on how do we reflect more on and really articulate our conceptions of learning so they don't remain implicit, and how do we use that to make sense of these important documents we have in front of us to guide our work. I want to emphasize, so this is the pattern we're going to be going in. We're going to talk about children's learning before lunch, teachers learning after lunch, and then tomorrow we'll look at the systems and organization layers. And I want to really emphasize some of this may feel too fast. We could spend a week on each of these or maybe more. I put that iceberg picture to remind myself to say, we're going to scratch the tip of the iceberg here today, okay? So notice when conversations feel incomplete and make a note for yourself to say, we need to keep having this conversation. And to that point, some of this work of really interrogating our own conceptions of learning and thinking about where we might want to maybe change them can feel a little bit hard sometimes. So I want to just put forth these learning stances that could be helpful today. So let's try to be okay with not knowing yet and engage in the messiness. There's a lot of unlearning that we as adults have to do for kids to learn in a different way. So let's be okay with the messiness of that today and support each other in that and support each other to share ideas in progress and to share things we're not sure about or can't quite picture yet. Okay, let's dive in. So we're going to think about children's learning for this little piece before lunch here. And I'm going to have you do a lot of reflecting back to your own experiences because that's where a lot of our conceptions of learning come from. So we're going to focus first on children as learners. How do we think about children as learners in mathematics classrooms? What are the images and assumptions we have about them as learners? And I'm going to start by having you reflect. Just some independent think time. What did it mean to be a math learner when you were a kid? And here we're thinking about the pre-K to 3-ish range. See how far back you can remember. And you might think about some of these things. What was your main job? What did other people think you brought to the table during math? What was considered successful or a failure, and how did you know? And what were you considered capable of? Let's take a minute just to really reflect back on our own experiences. Okay, I'm going to add a layer, and then when you feel ready, you can talk to a partner. But I want you to reflect on how did the ideas that just came to mind about what it meant to be a math learner as a kid, how did those relate to your social identities? And maybe what you saw in social identities of your classmates. We know that how kids are positioned in math and how they're seen as learners overlaps with other structures we have in society that label kids and put them in buckets, right? So think about how did those intersect? And when you feel ready, go ahead and share with a partner. Yeah. Interesting, yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring you back together. I know we could talk about this for probably the next year. Okay. Now, you probably heard some differences at your tables, but my guess is you also heard some similarities. I saw a lot of nodding. I also heard some people saying, I can't even remember what early math felt like, which is interesting to reflect on. Like, why? So we had differences. But what we know is that historically, classrooms, early mathematics classrooms have looked more or less the same for a long time. So we have some differences maybe, but let's see how much similarity we have. So historically, mathematics learners, I'm going to put some phrases up on the slide here, and if it relates to your experience, let's just go ahead and raise your hand. Let's see what it looks like. Raise your hand if you felt like you had to memorize. If you should not, that you should not make mistakes. That you don't know anything about math unless your teacher shows you. That you have to copy what they show you. That you should definitely only speak up if you know you have the right answer. That you definitely should not question how or why things are working. And that you're either right or wrong. There's no middle ground. You definitely, as a kid, do not have valuable ideas. And you are either good or bad at math. That it feels like you have deficits that need to be fixed immediately. So if you get something wrong, you are associated with that gap, and the teacher's job is to plug that gap. And you should definitely do math in your head, tools are for kids who are bad at math. You need to be fast. How many people, we can put our hands down for a second, how many people thought about times tables or time tests? Okay? And here's an interesting one that connects to that your math ability can be fairly assessed with one performance using one tool. So I can tell from one assignment that I give you, or one test, whether you're good or bad at math. So for me in 3rd grade, if you did well on one math test, you were plugged into the advanced math track that determined whether you got to take calculus as a senior. Right? Think about examples of that in our system. When I taught in New York, if you didn't pass the 3rd grade math assessment, you got held back. Okay? We use one assessment to decide who someone is in terms of mathematics. And the last one is you should work by yourself. Math is something you do by yourself. Okay, so just notice some of the emotions that maybe came up for you there. There's some interesting sounds happening. Not very much joy in some of these phrases. This is super important, though. If these are this common amongst us, these are this common amongst every single educator in the state. So if you think about our teacher learners, which we'll get to later, we have to remember that this is the context. And this is what they know. But let's think about what we want instead. So we're going to take 3 minutes on our own to look at the math essentials. We want just some quiet reflection time, and this might be a time where you want to start marking some things up if you're that kind of person, or maybe you want to write some notes. What do we want instead? And we're just focusing on how do we want to see our mathematics learners? What do we want to assume about them? What images do we want to have about them? What sticks out to you with that lens when you look at the math essentials? We're going to take 3 full minutes of independent thinking here. You can start in any part of it you want. You'll have a chance to chat in a moment, see if you can really dig into the document and see what you see. Okay, here's how we're going to process this with our groups. And this is going to be the first of a few steps we take here. So in a moment, you're going to get one of your pieces of poster paper that hopefully every table has. And I'm going to have you draw a T-chart, and we're going to save the right side. That's going to be for later. On the left side, here's what we want to make a list of. To bring the math essentials to life, adults need to assume that as learners, our children are. Let's try to capture our ideas here. What do we need to assume about our learners to really bring these essentials to life in a way that reflects the values, that reflects joy, that reflects classrooms that are hopefully different from how they felt for us as kids? Does everyone have a piece of paper? Okay, we're going to take 10 minutes for this. Go ahead and dive in. I'm going to pause your thinking for 1 second here. Maybe. I know it's hard to stop. I'm going to give you another minute or two, but I want to poke you to go a little deeper. I see a lot of the same, in many cases, kind of bigger, really important ideas on your papers. In the next 2 minutes, see if you can get a little more specific. So part of what I just put up is our historical ideas. Maybe see if that jogs any further ideas. Part of what we want to think about is really what do we need to assume about our kids if math instruction is really going to look different? Because guess what? We can enact the essentials in a way that reflects this still. So dig a little deeper for 2 more minutes. Okay, try to wrap up your thinking. Wrap up the conversation, or pause maybe. I told you some of these conversations might feel a little incomplete. Let's take a seat. And we're going to pause this poster, so if you were standing up, which I love, you can sit down for a minute if you want, or keep standing if that's better for your body. I want to repeat what I said 2 minutes ago. We can enact the essentials in a way that still assumes this about learners. You can enact a math talk in a way that still assumes this about learners. You can, if you imagine those kiddos playing with all the different wonderful things they had, you could have those same activities out, but assume this about them as learners. So articulating how we need to make different assumptions about learners than we experienced as kids and all of our teachers and educators in our systems experienced as kids is a really crucial step for us to bring these to life. We're going to come back to this poster in a minute, and I'm also going to encourage you at lunch to peek at some other posters because there's some really, really powerful ideas around the room. We're going to move on to goals, though. So how do the goals we have for our kids as learners shape how we teach them in the classroom? So again, reflect for yourself a little bit. When you were a kid, what do you think the goals your teachers and maybe family had for your math learning? You might think about what did they praise you for? What did they measure or pay attention to? What did your work or practice look like? What was considered good participation? Take a minute to just really dig back in your memory as far as you can. See what comes up for you. And as you feel ready, go ahead and share with a partner. Okay, let's pause. Thank you. Okay. There's different kinds of goals we can have for our learners. So here's what I want you to think about it, and let's raise our hands again like before. Raise your hand if one of the goals that came to mind was something about what you should know, a goal for your knowing. So that might be a content goal, understanding goal. Interesting. Okay. Raise your hand if a goal you thought of had to do with doing, a skill you would have as in math, a thing you would be able to do. Interesting. And the last one is becoming. So this is the disposition identity piece. Were any of the goals you initially thought about related to who you should be in relation to math? Interesting. So I bring these three up because it's a useful, I found it to be a really useful framework, but in a slightly different way. So if we think about learning, not as just things we can do or just things we can know, but at the intersection of we have to be able to know things, we have to be able to do things, and it's also directly tied up in who we see ourselves as. That learning is at the intersection of that, and you see that in the Math Essentials, where it talks about the goal of every child developing strong early mathematical understanding, skills, and dispositions. And this can be a departure for a lot of us, because in a lot of, at least when I was a kid, it was you need to learn all your facts, you need to learn all your algorithms, and you need to do it really fast. That was kind of the goal, and you should probably get some good grades along the way, right? So one of the tools I'm hoping I can give you today is the tool of using this framework to see the range of complexity in our goals for students. So it forces us to ask, what do we want students to know? What do we want students to be able to do? And how do we want them to see themselves in relation to mathematics, but also learning, the classroom, school, community, society? These are pieces that where we see the joy, the empowerment, right? The more meaningful life ideas that we were talking about earlier today, where math feels really like something that's powerful in our lives and something that can be something that we are connected to and competent of. So if we think about one of the essential practices, perseverance in problem solving, we could see that just as something that kids need to be able to do. But how do we see it differently if we think about it at the intersection of knowing, doing, and becoming? How I see myself, what I'm able to do, and what I know. So I probably need some different tools for solving problems. And I need to be flexible with those tools, and I need to know how to use those tools. But I also need to see myself as someone who can solve problems and whose ideas are valuable and who can keep puzzling through, and that's part of being good at math. That just because I suddenly don't know it, I should just give up, right? I know a lot of my students would come into 5th grade when I taught 5th grade. If they didn't know how to do it right away, if they didn't remember the way to do it, they would skip it. How is that different from the kid? How is the knowing, doing, and becoming different for the kid who says, what could I do with this? What do I know, right? Those are really different ways of thinking about the goals for our learners in terms of just this one essential practice. Today, for kids, we're just going to zoom in on becoming. So I want to encourage you later as a team or a bigger team, look at this document with the lens of knowing, doing, and becoming for kids. Today, because becoming is the one that often feels a little bit harder for us to think about, was not always historically part of how we thought about kids learning, and because of the deep connections to joy and the values and the bigger ideas that are core to this document, we're going to focus on becoming. So I want you to take a moment to think about the essentials. And we're going to think about it partially in relation to mathematics identity, but I also think it's bigger than that. So here's a definition of mathematics identity. This is from Julia Aguirre and her colleagues. My disposition and deeply held belief about who I am in relation to math and what I am competent of. What does it mean to hold this as a goal for our kids? So, take a moment on your own in the essentials. What goals do you see in relation to kids becoming? How do we hope, if you look in the essentials, what do you see in terms of how do we hope they see themselves in relation to mathematics, learning, the classroom, school? Okay, we're going to return to our poster. If you have any new ideas that you want to add about what we need to assume about our kids, definitely add them. But on the other side, let's write down our goals for how kids see themselves. So the left side is, what do we need to assume about them? The right side is, how do we want them to see themselves? How do they need to see themselves in order for these essentials to really come to life in our classrooms? So we're going to take about 5 minutes now, and then we'll come back to it more after lunch. Oh, no.
Every single one of ours has been a C.
I love it.
Finding joy here in this.
I love it. Okay, I am standing between you and lunch, so I definitely want to don't go over my time here. If you can pause, you'll have more time after lunch to keep digging into this. Again, if you look at your poster, it is perfectly possible to implement the essentials in a way that does not reflect any of these ideas. And these ideas aren't listed somewhere, really easy to see. When we look for them, we see them. But it's easy to read this document and maybe not see them if that's not your lens. So that's really the goal here, is to say, what are the lenses we need to bring to our reading of this? And what are the ideas we need to pull out as really central, so that we're bringing them to life in a way that really does reflect a change and not just the same thing we've always experienced in classrooms. Okay? So again, we were just thinking in this first session about our conception of children and their as learners and the goals we have for their learning. After lunch and tomorrow, we'll dig into some of the other layers of this, but this is where we're starting. How does our conceptions of children and who they are as learners and the goals we have for their learning shape our leadership of learning and educational change? My little nudge for you is either before lunch or after lunch, as you're walking around, take a look at other people's posters. See if you can bring back an idea to your group from someone else's poster that your group didn't quite think about yet. Russ?